Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Joanne McAlpine. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Loudoun County, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program. The League is proud to host events like this that inform, inspire, and connect our community. And we're always looking for new members to help us make it happen. If you're passionate about civic engagement, education, and supporting programs like this, we'd love to have you join us. You can learn more and find details about our next meeting, which is this Saturday, by visiting lwvloudon.org. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Priscilla Godfrey. Priscilla has been a resident of Western Loudoun County since 1979. She is a nationally certified quilt judge and a chapter member of the National Association of Certified Quilt Judges, known for her deep commitment to preserving and celebrating the art of quilting. Her quilts have been exhibited internationally as well as domestically in renowned venues such as the National Quilt Museum in Kentucky, the Houston International Quilt Show, the Virginia Quilt Museum in Dayton, and the American Quilters Society quilt shows in Pennsylvania and Lancaster. Locally, her works has appeared at the Loudoun County Government Center, Franklin Park Center, and Purcellville Town Center, where a permanent exhibition is open to the public during business hours. Priscilla is affectionately known as the Quilt Rescuer for her passion in reviving vintage quilts, quilt tops, and squares, transforming them into beautiful bed quilts and wall hangings. She also shares her knowledge through lectures on the history of Loudoun County at George Mason's Fairfax campus and was invited to speak on the history of quilting in Loudoun County at the American Quilt Study Group Planning Conference in Portland, Maine. She will be speaking. Her upcoming talk will be at Roswell Methodist Church in Philmont, Virginia, about the history of quilting on November 13th at 7 p.m. Beyond her artistic contributions, Priscilla served on the Loudoun County School Board for 8 years, demonstrating her dedication to community service. Her work has been featured in several publications like Inspired by Endangered Species, Inspired by DC, the Bulletin of Loudoun County History, Stitching Through History. Priscilla is the past president of the League of Women Voters of Loudoun County. She serves on the State Education Committee and fought to get the Virginia state government to help improve the Virginia school infrastructure. And with that, it's all yours, Priscilla.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I wanted to share what started me down this journey. And that is in 2019, a friend of mine contacted me and said, would you be interested in writing for the Loudoun County Bulletin of History, which is an annual publication that he heads up? And he said, I would love to see an article on women's rights and suffrage. So I did a deep dive and did my research and also studied up on how the passage of the amendment was reflected in the very first election that we had like that in Loudoun County. So all of this will be included in my talk this evening. And we are going to go and share my slides. Are you going to do that for me?
You have to do it from your end. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
That way you have control over it. Sorry. If you have trouble, I have it as a backup.
Okay. So this evening, what we're going to be studying is that the struggle for women's rights took place over 2 separate continents separated by the Atlantic Ocean, and this process took 48 long years to accomplish. The story includes violence, destruction, terror, fear, abuse, near death, prejudice, elation, coercion, euphoria, surprise, and near starvation. There were very strong personalities involved, which did not make this task any easier. And since this happened so very long ago, there are not many people still alive that are aware of the sacrifices made or the lengths to which these women went to secure this right. And as we will see, they faced many instances of imprisonment and torture. All of that occurred out of the light of day in prisons mostly. But some fortunately recorded their experiences so that we can learn of their sacrifice and the strategies they put in place today. Because this story is so compelling, there are many movies out there that I suggest you watch, beginning with the movie Suffragette, which was about the struggle in Great Britain. This movie was released in 2015 and is probably available on Netflix. The other movies are The Iron-Jawed Angels, One Woman, One Vote, and The Vote and Suffrage. So all you need to do is, click these things on your TV and watch them. So in the 1200s, British common law was the law of the land. This law subsumed married women's ability to own property, earn wages, enter contracts, inherit financial holdings of the spouse, or act autonomously to their husband's authority. All rights were vested to the husband. And when the husband died, it did not go to his wife, but instead his entire estate was passed on to his oldest brother, who took over management of the estate and the family. A married woman was a dependent like an underage child and could not own property in her own name. Women's responsibilities were restricted to raising the children, preparing the meals, and the feed and care of all livestock. This English common law, called the concept of couverture, which is the French word for cover, prevailed until the middle of the 19th century, when the economic realities of life in the New World in America demanded greater flexibility for women. And that is why in the books of the period and in the show Bridgerton, the women were especially anxious to marry well. For if they did not, they were in jeopardy of being moved to poorhouses. And you may be familiar with Emily Bronte, who secretly wrote books. In order to get published at this time, she had to write under a pseudonym, Ellis Bell. For men were the only ones taught to read and therefore the only ones purchasing books, and they were shocked to learn later that these books they enjoyed were not even written by men. Okay, slide 1. The Chartist movement in the 1840s in Britain was the first national movement of its kind and was an effort on the part of the working class to get voting rights. It was named after the People's Charter drafted in 1838, which also demanded the women's suffrage. In 18,
Priscilla, I'm
yes,
sorry. Am I on the right slide? Please tell me when to go forward.
I will just rest it there. In 1872, the fight became a national movement with the formation of the National Society for Women's Suffrage. The suffrage movement spread quickly to Wales, Scotland, and other parts of the United Kingdom. These movements did shift sentiment in favor of women's suffrage by 1906, at which point the militant campaign began with the formation of the Women's Social and Political Union. So you can see on this slide, it writes about the graffiti, breaking windows, setting buildings on fire. So the women in Britain decided they weren't going to pussyfoot around And they wrote, as I said, wrote graffiti on buildings, broke shop windows, and set churches on fire. Others of them attacked police officers and politicians. And this lady, Helen Crawford from Glasgow, actually smashed a liberal politician's windows. Next slide, please. So Emmeline, let me see. So in 1897, several of these groups decided to join forces, and they founded the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was led by Millicent Garrett Fawcett. This lady published widely on women's issues and was a frequent speaker on women's rights. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the British Women's Social and Political Union. Both groups pushed for passage of the United Kingdom Representation of the People Act, which gave the vote to all men over age 21 and all women over the age of 30, and tripled the electorate at that time. And in 1928, the laws were amended to include women ages 21 to 30. So they were way ahead of America. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 led to a suspension of party politics and the militant suffragette campaigns. Women stepped up at that time and took on jobs that men had been doing before the war. So this is a church that was actually burned down by the suffragettes. Next slide, please. This is another church, St. Catherine's Church, where they did exactly the same thing. Next slide, please. Here are the Pankhurst sisters. Emmeline is on the left. Her daughter, Emmeline, named Emmeline as well, is in the middle. And Sylvia, her youngest daughter, is on the right. So Emmeline, Sylvia, and Adela were leading figures on the militant side of this movement in England. They threw rocks through windows, set letterboxes on fire, chained themselves to railings, destroyed works of art, and set fire, as we said, to these churches. One member, Emmeline Davidson, of this group, was killed after she jumped in front of the king's horse at the Derby. The suffragettes were frequently arrested and jailed in prison. They refused to eat, going on frequent hunger strikes, and this in turn led to violent force feeding by tubes down their noses. The police came up with a plan called cat and mouse, whereby they would release them until they were well and then rearrest them and put them right back in jail. In fact, Emmeline, in this picture, was arrested and released 12 times within 1 year. Many historians believe that this suffragette militancy campaign actually set back the cause of women's suffrage. Their battle with the Liberal Party had become a kind of holy war. And their group, on the other hand, stayed the course and remained focused on obtaining suffrage. Next slide, please. So now we're going across the Atlantic Ocean to America. And our first action here is on July 9, 1948. The suffrage movement began at a tea party that was held by Janet Hunt, a Quaker living in upstate New York. She invited the following: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, and Mary Ann McClintock to tea. Now, as a result of this airing of their grievances over tea, these same women planned the very first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York, July 19 to 20 of 1848, and thus began a coordinated suffrage movement in the United States. Next slide, please. This is Alice Stone Blackwell. She was born in 1857 in New Jersey. Her family was dominated by involvement in the feminist movement. And upon her graduation in 1881, she wrote for the editorial staff of the Woman's Journal, an organ of her mother's American Women Suffrage Association. She helped her mother effect a reconciliation with this radical wing that I was describing of the suffrage movement. And they merged with the Susan B. Anthony National Women's Suffrage Association and became the National American Women Suffrage Association in 1890. Now, during 1887 to 1905, she edited and wrote the Women's Column, which was a periodical collection of suffrage news articles that was published in newspapers across the country. She was also active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Trade Union League, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she was, in fact, the founder of the Massachusetts League of Women Voters. Next slide, please. This is Harriet Tubman. Harriet served with the Union Army during the Civil War as a scout, a nurse, a spy, and a confidant. She escaped slavery and made it to Philadelphia, traveling alone under the cover of night in 1849. She spent more than 10 years making secret trips to Maryland, helping people escape the slavery in the South. Her very last rescue mission was in 1860. She and her husband married in 1869 in Auburn, New York, where he, Harriet, and her freed family members would live out their days. In fact, Nelson built the family home, which still stands as of 2024. And it is also where Tubman founded the Home of the Aged, where she cared for people with blindness, paralysis, and many other conditions. She was a staunch supporter of the suffrage movement, working alongside Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and suffragist Lucy Burns, where the two joined the National American Women Suffrage Association, and they soon became the DC chapter president. She was set on amending the U.S. Constitution, hence the Equal Rights Amendment, and Alice and Burns were the organizers of a protest parade, which was held on Pennsylvania Avenue on March 3rd, 1913. The parade finally got Wilson to agree to meet with them, although he would not push for the amendment. And disagreeing with the tactics followed by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they soon formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913. Which then founded the National Women's Party in 1916, and these groups were merged in 1917. Alice Paul was successful in 1938 in getting the League of Nations to include gender equality in the United Nations Charter and to include sex discrimination in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1930, the WSPU honored her with the Hunger Strike Medal for Valor, and two countries have honored her with postage stamps, Great Britain in 1981 and the United States in 1995. Hilary Swank played Alice Paul in the 2004 film Iron-Jawed Angels. And in 2022, oops, I made a mistake. I'm going to go back to page 7 and slide 10. Let's see where that is.
This is slide 10, Alice Paul.
Okay. Well, I'm going to finish up on Harriet Tubman.
Oh,
A
okay.
service to her community until the very end, Harriet's legacy remains relevant. In 2024, the U.S. made a Harriet Tubman commemorative coin. And on Veterans Day that same year, the governor of Maryland recognized her as one of the greatest authors of the American story, and they posthumously made her a one-star brigadier general. She is celebrated not only for saving hundreds of enslaved, but also for her many, many philanthropic efforts. Now we go on to Alice Paul. Alice Paul. This lady was a Quaker suffragist who fought to secure the women's right to vote. She was also the author of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was written in 1923 and remains not ratified. She states that when the Quakers were founded, one of their principles was and is equality of the sexes. She earned a biology degree in 1905, a sociology degree in 1907, and then she moved to England, where she studied social work and joined the militant British suffrage movement, was arrested on 7 different occasions and jailed 3 times. I believe in Britain, she learned about hunger strikes and forced feeding while she was there. Alice Paul returned to America in late 1909 and met fellow suffragist Lucy Burns. And the two joined the American Women's Suffrage Association. And Alice, of course, was set on the Equal Rights Amendment. So these groups band together. And in 1930, she was honored with a hunger strike medal for valor. And 2 countries, as I said, honored her with postage stamps. And Hilary Swank played her part in 2022. So that first performance on Broadway of the Suffs at the Public Theater on Broadway, Alice Paul was the main character. And I was so fortunate to be at that performance, and I'm looking forward very greatly to going to the Suffs again when it lands in DC. Next slide, please. Sojourner Truth. This former enslaved woman became an outspoken advocate for abolition, temperance, civility, and women's rights in the 19th century. In fact, her Civil War work earned her an invitation to meet with President Abraham Lincoln in 1864. She was born into slavery and was bought and sold 4 times and subjected to violent punishments. When she moved to New York City in 1828, she became a very popular, charismatic speaker. Next slide, please. Mary Terrell. Mary was indeed one of the very first African-American female students at Oberlin College in Ohio in 1838. My parents went to Oberlin. Having been an active suffragist during her years at Oberlin, she continued to be active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, where she met Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, she felt that there needed to be a group of African-American women to tackle the issues such as lynching, disenfranchisement of the race, and development of educational reform. As one of the few African-American women allowed to even attend these NAWSA meetings, she spoke often about the injustices and issues within her community. And in 1898, she gave a speech at a session of the group that was a call to action for that group to fight for the lives of Black women. She also addressed the double burden they had to overcome, their sex and race as well. In 1913, Alice Paul, when organizing a rally, she planned to relegate the African Americans to the back of the parade. This is what I'm calling prejudice. Wells and Terrell fought to integrate the march, but were not successful. So they ended up marching with their sorority, the Delta Sigma Thetas, instead. Now, toward the end of her life, she did see in 1954 the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education, which finally put an end to segregated schools. But just 2 months later, she died. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a study on the various parades that we women had for suffrage. This first parade occurred in New York City, February 16th of 1908. Notice the wardrobe there. It was very favored to wear white when you were in public, which was an example of your purity. Next slide, please. This was the Washington, D.C. parade, March 3rd of 1913, which really, really helped to put a stake in the ground. It was well publicized, was well attended. It occurred right there between the between the Capitol and the White House. It was a terrific parade. And next slide, please. Here's another shot of the DC parade. What they managed to do was to get someone riding a white horse to lead the parade. And that just really, people were cheering, and I'm sure some were booing, but it just set the right tone, I felt. Next slide, please. Here you go. Here's the horse. Next slide, please. And this was the New York City suffrage parade, October 23rd, 1915. You'll notice they're still wearing white. Next slide, please. Okay, after that, well, this is a newspaper clipping that has news about the parade on the left, but it also says Woodrow Wilson to become president on the right. So those two events kind of happened at the same time, and we'll talk about Woodrow later on. Next slide, please. Okay, this starts the what is called the Silent Sentinels. The suffragettes decided that they were going to give Woodrow Wilson a run for his money. He was newly elected as president, and they were going to keep themselves in front of him every single night. So these sentinels always happened just before dark, and hopefully you can read some of those signs. So just there in front of the White House gates, this became known as Silent Sentinels or Sentinels of Liberty. They were the very first group in history to picket the White House itself. And they started this campaign after they did meet with the president, January 9 of 1917, where he blatantly told them he would not support the women's suffrage amendment. So the protesters wanted to serve as a constant reminder to him of his lack of support for suffrage. So throughout the 2.5 year long vigil of being there every single night, many of these women were harassed, arrested, and unjustly treated. They were then organized by something called the National Women's Party, which was a militant suffrage organization. And they were first founded as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913 by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, following the parade they had on Pennsylvania Avenue. But by definition, it was an organization that took a militant approach to women's suffrage, kind of like I described in Britain. And they broke away from the more moderate National American Women's Suffrage Association. It really only lasted 3 years when its founders merged with the Women's Party. It became the National Women's Party. As you can see, these organizations flipped around, but they were all on the same side for suffrage. So the National Women's Party members were known primarily for this picketing and also going on hunger strikes when they ended up in jail. So some people approved of what they were doing and would actually bring hot drinks and hot bricks for their feet while they were picketing, because of course they were in the snow sometimes. Someone would help them hold up these heavy signs or even give them money. And members of the NAWSA feared that the pickets would actually lose them support from the public. Wilson, however, seemed to be unconcerned and even invited them in for coffee once, which of course they refused. And as the issue became bigger and the protests continued, he began to recognize that this group was making him look bad and would actually cause him to lose public support. So on June 22nd, 1917, the police arrested Lucy and Catherine on charges of obstructing traffic. And on June 25th, 12 women were arrested and sentenced to 60 days in jail or a $25 fine, which of course they refused to pay. Eventually, the District of Columbia Jail could not take any more of these prisoners, and they were taken to Virginia's Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. Once there, they were asked to strip and bathe, but were only issued one small bar of soap, which they refused to use, of course. Worms were frequently found in their food. Jail terms were getting longer and longer, reaching up to 60 days. And at the workhouse, Alice Paul was placed in solitary for 2 weeks with nothing to eat except bread and water. She ended up in the prison hospital where she began a hunger strike, which was joined by the other suffragists, and they were force-fed, having tubes put down their throats. So on the night of November 14th, 1917, which is known as the Night of Terror, 40 guards were ordered to brutalize these prisoners. And here's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about torture. They beat Lucy Burns and tied her hands to the cell bars above her head and left her there for the entire night. They threw Dora Lewis into her dark cell, where she smashed her head against an iron bed and suffered a concussion. Her cellmate, who believed her to be dead, suffered a heart attack. And guards grabbed, punched, kicked, choked, and beat these women. Finally, the newspapers began carrying their stories, which angered many Americans and created more support for the amendment. And in March of 1918, the D.C. Court of Appeals vacated all 6 suffragists' convictions. On January 9th, 2018, at last, Woodrow Wilson announced his support for the women's suffrage amendment. The next day, the House of Representatives narrowly passed the amendment, but the Senate refused to even debate it until October. So from January to October, there was no movement. When they did finally vote on it, it failed by 2 votes, and the arrests started up again. On December 16th, 1918, they began starting watchfires in front of this very same gate. And they made a stuffed figure, which was his image, in effigy at these same White House gates. The National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul, began to urge citizens to vote against these anti-suffrage senators who were all coming up for election in the fall of 2018. After that election, most members of Congress became pro-suffrage. And on May 21, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the amendment, followed on June 4th by the Senate. Now, the next step would be getting the 26 states, which were the 3/4 of total states in the Union, to actually ratify the amendment. Next slide, please. Oh, this is an example of one of the banners that the women displayed in front of the White House. Next slide, please. Okay, here we are. This is in Kentucky. The governor, Edwin P. Morrow, actually signed the amendment. And so Kentucky became the 24th state to ratify the suffrage amendment, January 6th of 1920. Next slide, please. In August of 1920, the struggle had come down to a series of votes in Tennessee. 4 other available states, Connecticut, Vermont, North Carolina, and Florida, would not even consider the resolution for their different reasons, and the remaining states had actually rejected the amendment. Supporters for both sides camped out at a Nashville hotel and began intense lobbying efforts that became known as the War of the Roses, because supporters wore yellow roses and the antis wore red roses. Now, the suffragists had lobbied this Harry T. Byrne. I mean, he was the youngest member of the State House. He was only 24. But they were totally unsure of how he would actually vote. And they knew that any vote to bring the amendment to the floor would be too close to call, as well as the following vote to ratify. So on August 18, the legislator, with all the people up in the balcony, the legislator voted on a motion to table or delay this ratification vote. And it seemed as if the Yellow Roses had enough votes to delay the amendment vote, especially after Byrne himself arrived wearing a red rose and then voted himself to table the amendment. But another representative, Mr. Banks Turner, switched sides during the roll call, leaving the vote deadlocked and moving the ratification vote forward. The suffragists would need one more vote to make the 19th Amendment the law of the land. And what happened next stunned the legislature. Early in the voting, Byrne, wearing the red rose and from a very conservative district, surprised everyone when he said in a clear voice, "Aye," when asked if he would vote to ratify the amendment. Lawmakers in Tennessee tried to delay the vote, tried to delay this approval. But on August 26, 1920, official documents arrived and they were quietly signed by the Secretary of State. Burns later explained that he initially voted to table the vote so that it could be brought back up in the next legislative session. But after it came to the floor, he had several reasons to change his vote. In his suit pocket was a letter from his mother, Feb E. Byrne, in which she asked him to be a good boy and vote for this amendment. She also said she was pressured by the governor of Louisiana's wife to recant her letter and say it was a fraud, which she absolutely refused to do. Now, he is reported as saying, I appreciated the fact that an opportunity seldom comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery, and this opportunity was mine. Okay, our next slide is the Capitol building statue. Just 6 months after the 19th was ratified, it'll go back one. Just 6 months after the 19th was ratified, an assembly of more than 70 women's organizations and members of Congress convened at the Rotunda for the unveiling of a massive statue featuring the mothers of the suffrage movement. On your left, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In the middle, you have Lucretia Mott. And on your right, you have Susan B. Anthony. None of these three women lived long enough to see enfranchisement occur. But on that day in 1921, the statue was gleaming, and an inscription proclaimed that women first denied a soul, then called mindless, now arisen, declaring herself an entity to be reckoned with. And everyone was super happy. You know, you had the senators there and all these people, relatives of the first three women. The very next day, the statue was removed, and taken underground in the Capitol to a service closet and stored with brooms and mops. Over and over again, Congress refused to approve bills that would have restored the statue upstairs where it truly belonged. It wasn't until 1963 that the crypt was cleaned up and opened to the public. But the nice plaque that was on there was gone, and no mention was ever made about who made this statue. Congress kept refusing to move it. It said it was too ugly, too heavy, too expensive to go upstairs. So the women's organization set to raising money. And on May 14th, 1977, the statue was finally moved back to the Rotunda. It was a rainy day that day, but when the statue moved outside, the sun broke through, and all attending were cheering and crying. It was well past time that these brave women were recognized. Of the 100 statues in the Statuary Hall, only 9 represent women. Just 5 of the hundreds of statues in New York City feature historic women, and only 3 of the 152 national monuments and National Park Service sites are of historic female figures. We are still being bashed. At the state capitol in Richmond, Virginia, there is a statue garden on the grounds featuring suffragettes from Virginia. And at the workhouse in Lorton, Virginia, where so much strife occurred, there is also a statue garden on the right, also featuring many famous figures from the suffrage movement. And this statue would not have occurred had it not been the League of Women Voters in Fairfax County. And this occurred just recently. I went to a fundraiser, I don't know, 2015, 2017. And we finally had enough money to have that beautiful suffrage garden there. And I really encourage people to get out there and check it out. The statue being reinstalled at the Capitol marked the beginning of another pursuit for a National Museum of Women in the Arts, which finally opened in Washington, D.C. in 1981. I note that the Equal Rights Amendment, written by Alice Paul, required 38 states to ratify. And it wasn't until Virginia, our state, voted. And that was January 20th, 2020, that they reached that goal. However, the secretary to the Capitol is still saying that this occurred after this arbitrary deadline. So this amendment is still not added to our Constitution. And I proudly note that January 20th, 2020, 3 members of this League of Women Voters were there in the balcony to witness that happening. We had our sashes on and the whole 9 yards. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a banner that I made for the Mancuso show up in Pennsylvania recently. And it's going to be also shown in February at the Mancuso show down in Hampton Roads. Next slide, please. End of slideshow. There should be more slides than that. Okay,
That's
I'll
all I
just roll
see.
with it.
Sorry.
That's right. At the beginning of the 20th century, elaborate hats were ubiquitous and were fastened to their hair by these long hat pins. At the time, there were men known as mashers who leered at, called, or unwantedly touched women in public. Newspapers across the country reported stories of women using their hat pins and umbrellas to fend off attackers. And by 1909, hat pins were considered dangerous around the world. In many states in the United States, women could actually be fined up to $50 for wearing hat pins more than 9 inches long. So the fight for women's suffrage reached a fever pitch in the early 20th century, and the United Kingdom women were experiencing increasing resistance. In order to protect themselves, they started learning the Japanese martial art of jujitsu. Media outlets started reporting on this trend, as well as on martial artists such as Edith Garud, who was teaching jujitsu to members of the Women's Social and Political Union. So soon the term became suffrage jujitsu, and I think that's what happened with that term suffragists. Because of the hat pins, we became suffragists. So in 1848, New York State passed the Married Women's Property Act, which was the same year as the Seneca Falls Convention, which started the movement in the United States. Many other states in the 1800s began passing laws that overrode the caveats I mentioned before, called couverture. The League of Women Voters was created by Carrie Chapman Catt on February 14, 1920, to become the successor to the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, in Richmond, Virginia, in 1909, the Equal Suffrage League was formed as a state organization to campaign for suffrage. Loudoun County actually joined the Equal Suffrage League on August 10 of 1915, with 15 members attending. The chairman was actually Miss Charlotte Boland of Middleburg. She was headmaster of the Foxcroft School for Girls, which is still in operation today and is only a couple of miles from my very house. And she was a force to be reckoned with. So I'm surmising that the members at large were Mrs. D.E. Sands and Mrs. E.L. Brown. Members from Lovettsville were Miss Frida Johnson, from Bluemont, Miss Eliza Lunsford, Mrs. Henry Page, and Mrs. Harry Doolin. And from Hillsborough, she had the teachers Mrs. W.S. Hammerly and Mr. C.C. Gover. And I think there were a couple of men in there because I can just see her going up and down the hall, male teachers. You will be coming to this meeting. In 1946, we became the very first league in Virginia as a rural county. As before that time, the leagues were located in major cities such as Falls Church, Richmond, etc. In 1944, the league was recognized by the United Nations as one of the very first non-governmental organization and still remains as an official observer status today. In 1957, the League's Education Fund was established to serve as a separate arm for voter registration and information. In 1980, the League actually sponsored televised general election presidential debates in 1980 and 1984, and presidential primary forums in 1980, 1984, 1988. But as candidates became increasingly partisan, we had to withdraw our sponsorship in 1988. In 1993, the League campaigned for the passage of the National Voter Registration Act that increases accessibility to the electoral process. In 2006, the League established a dedicated website for voter information known as vote411.org. In 2021, the League campaigned for changes that were made through the redistricting process in Virginia. Now, Loudoun County was known in the 1800s for its agriculture. We had 5 different plantations that were growing cotton, tobacco, corn, dairy, grains, and beef cattle. The large plantations, Morven Park, Selma, Belmont, Oak Hills, and Oatlands, were concerned that granting women the right to vote would lead to women of color voting. And during the Civil War, we had both sides represented and both sides rampaging and fighting all over the place. The county, I know, did elect 2 anti-secessionists to the Virginia State Convention in 1861. So on October 4, 1920, there were 3,400 women eligible to register to vote. Only 200 women, however, completed their registration and are recorded as voting. The Loudoun Times-Mirror reported that 18 of those voting were colored women. Now, current statistics are that the Virginia General Assembly has 46 women legislators, which is only 33% of all the legislators. In Nevada, 60% are women. In Colorado, 46%. In Rhode Island, 45%. And in West Virginia, less than 12% are women. So we have some work to do on the Virginia General Assembly. In the United States Congress, 125 are women, which is 28.7% of the 540 total members, which comes out to 29% in the House and 25% in the Senate. Really have work to do there. The fight for women's rights is far from over, and in many respects, women continue to be second-class citizens. In fact, as late as 1970, a woman's application for credit could be denied because men were the only ones who could have a bank account. So when I got married in 1973, I could not have my own checking account. I had to be under my husband's name on his checks. 1970 was like just yesterday. The Equal Opportunity Act, which occurred in 1974, finally prohibited credit discrimination based on sex or marital status. But I know we're still having difficulty getting a female president or having women promoted to top leadership positions in business. We are never given credit for the many ways we contribute to society, raising children, and running the many nonprofits we depend on. And it was stubbornness to the point of death that got us this right to vote. And that tenacity must continue. The colors of the suffrage sash represent the following. Yellow represents hope, white represents purity and liberty, and the purple represents loyalty and steadfastness. The National Women's Party sash was very similar, with purple, white, and gold. And 6 months before ratification, the League had 500,000 members across more than 750 local and state league chapters nationwide. I will take questions.
Okay. There is a question. I just wanted to mention you mentioned about the having it to get a credit card. My mother, I think it was either the late 70s or early 80s. Uh, I'm from a large family of 11 children, and she wanted a tubal after the last one. And she had to get permission from her husband to get this tubal. And my father didn't want us to know. I found out by other means, but I found out. But yeah, and I years and years later, I told her that, and she started crying because it's like I had to keep that a secret. But yeah, you had to get permission to get medical care done back then.
Yeah, exactly.
I see one question. If anyone else has questions, please put it in the Q&A box below. And it's from Nancy, who asked, why did they target churches? I was curious about that too.
I'm not sure why, but churches in general are very conservative,
Mm,
and priests have no trouble transferring their political beliefs to their congregations.
mm,
So I'm sure in Britain it was very much an issue having women struggling for women's rights, because probably the church did not believe that women should be enabled to participate in the political process. That
Do
was
you know
not a womanly thing.
Do you know if it was because it was St. Mary's, but there's St. Paul's too. If it was the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church that they burned down? Because the Church of England, then you're attacking the monarchy, and that could be their objective. That'd be curious to look into.
Yeah, right.
Mm.
I don't know, but the church is being very conservative, generally speaking, that I can see that would be complicated for them.
Mm. Yeah, they probably had access to it too. Any other questions? I think that's it. And so thank you, Priscilla, for that inspiring presentation. I feel that it's one of the other things that I'll point out. I didn't even know that women had to fight for the right to vote until I was in my 30s. Yep, 30s. I
Ah,
saw it on PBS and I saw that the women were being attacked and their clothing pulled off, and I was like, what's this going on? And they said that women had to fight for their right to vote, and I was stunned. So thank you, PBS. But
right.
I appreciate you giving this, taking your time and telling this story, because it is important and it needs to get out there because it's not being taught in schools, and it really needs to. It's usually just a little asterisk that I've been told from my kids. They at
Yeah,
least get the
yeah.
asterisk. I went to Catholic school too.
Ah,
So anyway,
yeah,
um,
there really needs to be more knowledge passed on to
mm,
future generations. They need to
yeah.
know how much it cost to get this valuable right.
And to keep an eye on it that they don't try to take it back because some people would take it
Yeah,
back. Yeah. Be
exactly.
vigilant. Yeah. Thank you again. And
You're
thank you
welcome.
everyone for joining. Um, good night. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you.